This episode of Alt Text is presented by CanadianTech.com, where Canadian innovators meet. Subscribe to one of their local newsletters at www.canadiantech.com. Hi everyone, this is Alt Text. I'm your host, Erin G. It's the first episode of this, my new show, and I am so excited to bring you a slate of really interesting and fun guests this season. To kick things off, I was fortunate to be joined by Frances Haugen, a senior fellow in residence at McGill's Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. But you may recognize her name from being the Facebook whistleblower. In 2021, Haugen left her job at Facebook as the lead product manager on the civic misinformation team, after becoming increasingly alarmed by the choices Facebook was making that prioritize profits over public safety and putting people's lives at risk. She opted to blow the whistle on them by sharing thousands of internal Facebook documents, which revealed that the company was well aware of the negative effects their products had on the public. Since then, she has been advocating for social media that prioritizes users over profits by engaging with lawmakers all over the world. At McGill, Haugen will support research and public engagement on online safety policy, youth digital rights, and data transparency. We chatted about why she opted to come to Canada to do this work and the opportunities for Canada to balance freedom and safety, while also looking into the future about how we can protect youth and future iterations of the internet. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I have been really looking forward to this conversation, and I work kind of at the intersection of tech and public policy, and I'm a freelance writer among other things, but I also have an interest in Web3. So
Cool.
I'm hoping that we can kind of touch on a bunch of different things.
Sure. Whatever you want to talk about.
And so you are right now the fellow in residence at the Max Bell School at McGill. And, for those who may not be aware of their work, what made you pick Canada to work on, to do your work? And what do you hope to achieve there?
Totally. So I live in the United States. I grew up in the United States. Right now we are having, you could describe it as like a political moment where we struggle with bipartisanship. And one of the things that I've tried very, very hard since I first came out, starting with my choice to work at the Wall Street Journal over, say, maybe the New York Times or the Washington Post, is that I want to reach across the aisle. I want this to be an issue that isn't viewed as like a conservative issue or a liberal issue. It's an issue about democracy. And in the United States, even academia is really associated with teams. There's things that are just, the political environment is so polarized. And when I got the offer from McGill, I was really excited because one of my favorite professors, Taylor Owen, works at McGill. I think he's one of the most practical people in the public policy space in terms of understanding the limitations of what technology can actually do, and what is a constructive or not constructive way to approach regulation. And the fact that it gives me a way to be able to influence the conversation around how should we move forward without being associated with a team in the United States. And so between the attraction of getting to work with the team at McGill and the fact that it gives me it allows me to continue to try to work in a bipartisan way, it's an amazing opportunity. And I think there's this interesting moment for Canada, which is there are rumors that in the next year there potentially is going to be introduced tech accountability policies in Canada. And I'm a big proponent that the only way we can have a democratic conversation about what to do about social media is if people understand what choices are available for them to make. And up till now, that conversation has really been framed by the social media companies. And when I think there's an opportunity, and this is like specifically what my job is at McGill, to help raise awareness around how can we have this conversation? Like, what are the different things people can focus on, or what are the different approaches that are available to us? Because that's the way we're going to have a lively, effective democratic debate about how to move forward.
Yeah, I know that the Canadian government held a series of roundtables on
Mm-hmm.
the online harms like legislation, and I think Taylor was part of those or has
Mm-hmm.
been
The
involved
expert
in some of
panel.
those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that it makes total sense. And unfortunately, that kind of lack of bipartisanship that you were mentioning is creeping up to Canada. Uh,
Yeah.
and there is an increase in populism and generally like a gross misunderstanding of the definition of free speech. And so
Hmm.
like there this big movement towards free speech and like this like increasing anti-government sentiment. So when you're
Mm.
trying to reach across the aisle that way, like what do you hope, what's the message that you're trying to
Hmm.
convey to convince people that the work you're doing is valuable and have them understand that?
I think it's totally reasonable to be skeptical about state action. Like I am personally like I'm like a little, it's called a little D Democrat. Like I grew up in Iowa. I really believe that there's a lot that we can do for things like tech accountability through what I call like the ecosystem of accountability. That's like, litigators and investors and concerned citizens and like the whole thing working as activists. But the only way we can do those things is if we have information. And one of the things that I'm really excited about where Canada's going is, I think Canada made a pretty big misstep, a couple of years ago when the first version of how they approached online harms was really about, like you said, like infringing on free speech. It was like, let's take down all the bad things. And the problem with that is that, take down the bad things sounds really intuitive. It's like, I see bad thing, let's take it down. But the problem is that when you actually try to do that with technology, it's really, really hard to classify language in a precise way. We can literally do something as basic as take two sentences that mean the same thing and show it to a bunch of people. And we're only going to get 90% agreement on do these two sentences mean the same thing? Like that's about as basic as it gets. And we can't even agree on that. And so the thing that I'm excited about is the expert panel and the citizen assemblies. So they brought together large numbers of Canadian citizens, had them sit down for like a week and have hard conversations about how do we move forward. All of those groups came to kind of the same path, which is we need to have laws that require these companies to disclose what risks they know about, like what are the harms they know about, develop plans on how they're going to reduce those risks, and give us the data, like actually allow us to ask questions and get real answers that would allow us to see if they're making progress. And for the thing I keep emphasizing over and over again is our free speech is being infringed today, right? Like Facebook gives you a 3 sentence description of like what is hate speech and like what they're going to take down. And they have a 40-page manual internally of like what they're going to take down. Like we don't actually get to see how these systems perform. Like what are we allowed to say and not say? With passage of reasonable laws, we can begin holding these companies accountable for like how they moderate our speech. And so I think there's that's part of why I'm so excited to be working with McGill is we really need to expand awareness that these companies cannot be allowed to operate in the dark. And the way that we get to start having a democratic debate is by passing a law that allows us to ask questions and get information. So I think there's a common path forward on at least transparency that we urgently need to push ahead on and table.
Yeah, and I think a lot about the laws that have been passed in the EU. They've got really
Mm-hmm.
stringent laws about the use of big data, and they have a lot of laws around, the social media regulation. And I believe it was last week or the week before where Twitter was like, actually, we might start thinking about pulling out of Europe
Yeah.
because of these regulations, because they don't agree or align with our
So
new like ethos.
yeah. So it's a little more subtle than that. So it's Twitter pulled out of something called a code of practice which is a voluntary thing right now of saying, hey, like this is how we're going to approach misinformation. This is how we're going to be transparent with the government. This is how we're going to approach things internally. And Twitter pulled out and said, hey, like we are just not going to do it. Like we don't want to. And I'm guessing it was less because of the ethos and more because like they've just fired a lot of people who were doing those jobs. Like it's probably actually quite hard for them to comply right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I find so interesting about it is, when they first pulled out of the code of practice, they didn't say we're going to leave Europe. But as soon as Europe came back and said, hey, I know it's voluntary right now, but when the law goes into effect in August, it's not going to be voluntary anymore. So like, and then Elon came out and said, well, maybe we'll leave Europe. I think the thing that most people aren't aware of is if Facebook left Europe, I don't know, they lose maybe 7% of their users, 8% of their users. If Twitter left Europe, I think they'd lose 25 or 30% of their users. Like they're much less international than Facebook is. And so given how much Elon is already struggling, I think he can choose to do that. But I think probably what happened is he fired a lot of his policy team. He might not even have known what the consequences were of pulling out of the code of practice. So I think that's where we're currently standing with Twitter.
Seems like a real fuck around and find out situation.
Yeah. Well, Elon's pioneering new strategies for management. He's an innovator.
Yeah, he's something. You talked about how,
but I do want to give Elon a teeny bit of credit, which is, and I always try really hard that when the platforms do good things, I try to give them props because we get more things we compliment. Elon actually published the algorithm, or we think he published the algorithm for how Twitter works. And the thing I want to draw attention to is, for most people who have not written code, they may not be aware that like older versions of code are usually a lot worse. The code gets better with time. So your early versions, you're like, I wish no one would see that. And Elon didn't just publish how the algorithm works today. He published the history on the algorithm. And I thought that was very brave. And so he needs to do a lot more. We need outcome data. We can't just have these inputs. He got rid of the API that allowed academics to observe Twitter. There's a lot of problems, but we should give him props for at least, being the first mover on publishing the algorithm.
For sure. And like the fact of the matter is that running any of these platforms is a very hard job, and you have to be comfortable enough in yourself and your decisions that you are okay with some people being really mad at you all the time.
Oh yeah, all the time.
Like I would never want any of those jobs. God, what?
I think you were more aware of the scope of the job than Elon was before he bought Twitter. So
you mentioned that in order to kind of ensure that we actually have free speech and not dealing with any of the unintended consequences that these platforms are putting on us with their opaque policies that we don't have any insight into, that we need to pass kind of like smaller scope legislation or some sort of like light legislation or regulation in order to kind of mold that. And I think a lot of concern around regulating platforms from a business perspective is it stifles innovation, it hurts small businesses.
Yeah.
And so how do you convince people that regulation is a good thing? And like this is a big issue in both the US and in Canada.
Yeah. So one of the things I've been talking about a lot is we need to start talking about regulation in terms of a consumer bill of rights, right? Like we have rights when it comes to other products, when it comes to kids, companies have to think of like if you have a product that a kid's going to be near, like my earpods, right? I guarantee you someone at Apple has sat and thought about like, what is the choking hazard on this? Like what can we do to make this like, slightly more kid safe? And that's because there's laws that say you have a duty of care that you need to think about children. We think about things like bookcases falling over. We think about other things that are just systemic dangers. You have to have plans for it, and you have to inform customers about risks. Right now, when it comes to social media, we think of them as frivolous products. We're like, oh, it's a free, fun thing. It's funny dances, it's pictures of cats. It's still my cousin's breakfast. We don't think about it as the idea that it influences us in any way. And I think the thing that I'm super excited about is, last week, the Surgeon General in the United States issued an advisory about teenage mental health and social media. So for context, if you aren't a public health nerd, there's only been, there's less than 15 of these advisories in the last 50 or 60 years. It's things like cigarettes kill people, breastfeeding is good for infants, obesity is serious, seatbelts save lives. They're really basic things. And they're things that we take for granted. And historically, when we have seen these kinds of advisories come through, it's kind of like the period at the end of a sentence. The sentence is, children are being harmed. The tech companies are not solving this problem on their own, and we need to do something, period. And I think the thing that the way I would talk to someone who's concerned, saying like, I don't know if we should act, is we should say things like, what should be our relationship with technology? Do you have the right to reset an algorithm without losing your past? Right? People pediatricians talk to me about how they see kids struggling with eating disorders who say, I'm trying to make better decisions now, but it follows me on Instagram. These kids have to choose between the documented history of their childhoods, their friends, and their futures. We deserve to have the ability to know what's happening. We deserve to be able to know how we're being censored. And so I think framing these things in terms of, what should be our Bill of Rights, I think that's a way to find a common ground. It doesn't have to be about what you can and can't say online. It should be about what do we deserve in terms of our relationship with these platforms, given that we're giving more and more of our information environment over to them.
Yeah, in Canada and the US, well, the US is working towards this, but they have, the airline passenger Bill of Rights, which would,
Totally.
you get compensation for, however long of a delay. And so,
or you can't be trapped on planes. That's why that got passed.
Yeah. There was I'm in Ottawa, and there was a train here coming in from Montreal that was stuck on the tracks it was like 30 degrees out, and so 90 plus, and it was for like 5 hours, and the air conditioning was broken.
Brutal. And they probably ran out of water. Ooh.
Yep. Yeah, just awful. But you mentioned the statement by Vivek Murthy, and other government officials and experts have been ringing this alarm about the effects of social media on children and youth. And I have friends with kids, and kids these days are basically born with a device in their hands. And so how do we make sure that the children of today are better equipped than, say, you or I are, to grow up with the appropriate skills to question what they see online, and to be broadly better digital citizens?
So I think that is an amazing question, but I think we actually need to divide into two questions, because there's this question of how we're going to raise digital citizens for the 21st century, because that's what someone who can question is. It's someone who can process information environment, who can navigate this new world. But there's a second question, which is, there are children on these platforms under the age of 13, 14 years old who are not at a level of cognitive maturity to safely use these platforms. So part of why the Surgeon General issued that warning was, children who use social media for more than 3 hours a day are at substantially higher risk of depression and other mental health issues. The average child in the United States uses social media for 3.5 hours a day. Sleep deprivation is one of the top risk factors for a whole bunch of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, even more serious things like schizophrenia and bipolar, and all cause death rates, right? Not just automotive accidents, but other kinds of accidents, or substance use issues, both uppers because they're tired, downers because they're depressed. Right now, 30% of teenagers in the United States say that they use social media till midnight or later most weeknights. Right? So there's two things here. There's this question of what is the minimum floor of safety that we can do for kids? And that's things like, if we had a Bill of Rights, we deserve real ways of modulating our use, particularly late at night. That could be things like, I talk about this a lot. If you slightly slow down an application, people use it a lot less. We've known for 20 years that if you make it 5 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds slower, people use it a lot less. You could imagine an alternative world where you could pick a bedtime at noon when you still have willpower. And for 2 or 3 hours before that, the app could get a little bit slower and a little bit slower until you got sleepy and you go to bed. Those are kind of the baseline safety measures that we have to talk about right now, because more and more kids are dying, right? The second question is around, how do we raise digital citizens for the future? I think this is one of these things where there's a number of countries around the world, like Finland, that have really good media literacy curriculums built into schools. The idea that we are moving into a world where media is more and more balkanized. There are more and more independent sources, and people have to be educated on how do I navigate and criticize those sources. I think that's a vital thing that we need to have in our education curriculums. But the secondary thing is, I think having more awareness of, what are options. So in a world where we could pass a law like the Digital Services Act, which is what Europe passed last year, we would now have information. We'd be able to ask even basic questions, things like, how many moderators speak French? How many moderators are allocated for Canada and for Canadian French? Really basic questions, and actually get answers. Because right now, governments around the world, even governments around the world, don't get those answers. So in a world where the public could actually be informed about what the risks are of the different things they're using, you can start to then educate the public on, hey, what if we had a public option? What if your local library ran your local social network? What's the difference between getting most of your information from group chats versus an algorithmic stream? Getting your information from people you know versus from what a computer thinks you want to know. That's, I think, part of the conversation for the future, where we want to always be trying to give people more real choices versus having people either mindlessly consume or having the government come in and take away choices.
Yeah, and I think there's a challenge. So it's one, using things like behavioral insights, behavioral economics, and two, being more aware of the public health effects, and then three, kind of looking at the incentive structures and the choice architecture built into these things. I know
I want to leave one more. I want to leave one more thing though. I know a lot of parents are out there probably listening to your podcast, and it can feel really overwhelming when people talk about these things. It's like, my kids are in danger. I don't know how to navigate this. Like I can't just take it. All my children's friends are on these platforms. I can't just isolate them. If you currently don't have your kids' phones charged in your bedroom at night, please start doing that. Like, that's probably the single biggest thing you can do to help your kids. Because like I said, sleep deprivation is essential, especially when kids are growing. And it's at least a step forward you can do for acting now.
Yeah. As someone who has worked inside one of the biggest social media companies in history and has seen a lot of shit, as we work towards building a quote unquote new version of the internet with Web3, how can we avoid making those same mistakes that we did with the Web 2 situation?
I have a lot of hope that we're going to see the emergence of a creator-owned social network. So right now, when you take that picture of your breakfast, when you take a picture, do that cat picture, you're creating the fuel that allows those companies to make money off of it, like make money. People don't consume unless people create. I have a lot of hope that Web3 is going to start seeing, a rise of different economic models where you can crowd raise funding for these platforms. You can have creators have influence over the mechanisms that allow them to generate revenue. And I think we need to move towards systems where people feel ownership and the ability to influence these places where they spend all their time. And I think Web3, because you can start having these, token-based systems, things where people have voting rights, where you can have distributed democracy. I think there's real possibilities there. And I think it'll be super interesting to see them play out over the next, 10 years.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Vancouver.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, that does it for this week's episode of Alt Text. A big thank you to Frances Haugen for joining me for a short but interesting conversation. And of course, the team at McGill's Center for Media Technology and Democracy for helping arrange the interview. You can find me on the Bird app at Aaron_G, and I'm also on Blue Sky. So I hope to hear from you soon. See you next time.